feature presentation.
Matt, thank you so much for taking the time to talk to me. I really appreciate it. I just wanted to start off with asking you about, there has been so much in terms of coverage on this story, whether it be novels, television, podcasts, the Richard Fleischer movie, The Boston Strangler. What made you want to tell this story now and from the perspective of journalists Loretta McLaughlin and Jean Cole?
Yeah. So I grew up in Boston and I had heard about the Boston Strangler my whole life, but it wasn't until I started reading about it a few years ago that I realized that I really didn't know anything about the case. And I read every book that I could get my hands on. I listened to this incredible podcast called Stranglers, and I talked to people who were around at the time, some who worked in the newsroom. Um, and I discovered this really incredibly layered murder mystery at the heart of the story, with a lot of unexpected twists and turns, and as much a story about the changing identity of the city of Boston at the time. And I found all of that really interesting, but I didn't, none of it really clicked in terms of like, through what character would I tell this story? And then I discovered these reporters, Loretta McLaughlin and Jean Cole, who were, among the first reporters to connect the murders. They really broke the story of the Boston Strangler. They even gave the Strangler his name during the course of their reporting. And I discovered a personal connection to one of the reporters. And the more I learned about them, the more I grew to admire them, both as people and as journalists. And I felt like telling the story through their perspective would be a really worthwhile and compelling way to revisit this case.
Where was the first piece of media or information that you found these two journalists? Because there's not a lot of information on them, and it does seem like it is almost, a task in itself to discover, who they were as people and journalists.
Yeah, I think I was watching like one of those biography, true crime documentaries, TV documentaries, and there was like a 30-second interview with Loretta. And you're right, there's almost nothing available about either of them online. Um, and so I started trying to track them down to find out all the information that I could. And I read Jean Cole's obituary, and it mentioned that she had two daughters. And I looked them up on Facebook, and one of them had a Facebook profile, and she had one photograph. And in the photo, she had her arm around an old friend of mine. And so I called my friend, and I said, how do you know this woman? And she said that that was her mom, and that Jean Cole was her grandmother, and this woman who she revered. And so once I made the connection to the families, I was able to learn all that I could about these two reporters and the lives they led.
Were they able to supply you with any newspaper articles or information that kind of helped shape the narrative even more so than you're initially going through all of this information that is available?
Yeah, they yeah, they made me aware of an archive that had all of the reporting online. So all of the Record American newspaper articles for, you know, decades had been scanned and had digitized and put in this archive. So I was able to go back and read every single piece that they had written about the Boston Strangler. And I was able to, ask questions about what it was like growing up in that household with parents covering this story. So it was invaluable in that sense. And, really just trying to get a sense of who they were and the lives they led.
Was there any particular article that really gave you a sense of the period or perspective that hadn't really been covered in that way before?
There's an incredible one thing that I discovered in reading their reporting is that, like, journalism has changed so much, and their language, there was a real noir quality to their writing, which I found so fitting for the story. And I was so taken with it. I actually was able to use some of it as Kira's voiceover in the film. So some of that we were able to bring some of that on screen. But they were just really, devoted to chasing down this story and trying to keep people informed, particularly women informed, at a time when the city was living in fear of this killer, and at a time when the police department was coming up short.
Um, I think an important thing to discuss is the movie doesn't sensationalize or feel exploitative in terms of how the victims are treated. One thing that I wanted to ask you about that is, are you conscientious right from the beginning of telling the story through almost an audio sort of sensory kind of way? Because again, like there's this sound play that feels very well developed, and it leaves you kind of with your own sort of thoughts of what's going on in any one scene.
Yeah, I mean, there's sort of two objectives. One, these are real people, real victims who had left real families behind, and so we wanted to be really respectful of them. But we also wanted to make it horrifying. And we actually found that depicting a lot of this violence off screen, so that you hear a murder while you're watching a faucet dripping, is in many ways more horrifying than if we were to try and depict it on camera. So it kind of served two purposes: to be respectful of the victims, but also create tension and depict these crimes in a way that was adequately horrifying.
Um, Another thing that I was curious about, because again, like with every genre, there are milestones within, certain films. Did you take any influence from other serial killer movies like David Fincher's Zodiac or Bong Joon-ho's Memories of Murder? There was another movie I was thinking a lot about as well, Once Upon a Time in Anatolia. These movies that kind of play with ambiguity, but also, aren't necessarily spoon feeding you in terms of telling the story.
Yeah, I mean, we looked at all of those references, from anything from how information is laid out, to color palette and placement of camera. Obviously took a lot from Fincher, but just really wanted to use camera in a way that was very restrained, but also heighten the sense of tension. Same thing with the production design and the color palette and the quality of light, letting the darks really go dark. We just wanted this feeling of dread and the sort of the weight of these killings to carry over every dimension of the film.
A question that I'm always curious about when it comes to cinematography, we always talk about aspect ratios on the show. I wanted to know, streaming on Hulu and Disney Plus Canada, does that play a decision into shooting in 185?
We actually shot 239, and
Okay.
I think I just preferred the aspect ratio in terms of the environments that we were filming, from the newsroom to some of these long hallways, being able to feel that foreground while you're moving through a space. I really we decided we really liked the aspect ratio regardless of the exhibition format. It just felt like the right aspect ratio for this story.
Thank you so much for clearing that up and taking the time to talk to me. I wish I could go longer because there's so much to get into, but thank you so much, Matt. I really appreciate it.
Thank you, Eric. Appreciate it.